am Elaine Hagopian, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. Today's program is a tribute to our recently deceased friend, Dr. Naseer Aruri. Today we will show part one. Next week we will conclude the program. That will be part two. Let me share with you a short history of Dr. Aruri's history with the Arab American community and his role in the human rights community as well. 1967 devastated Arab Americans. This was the 1967 war where Israel invaded Egypt and Syria and took over the rest of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Arab American intellectuals and professionals realized they had shirked their responsibility to educate the public about the unjust conflicts in their homelands, and thereby challenged the mendacious portrayals manufactured by Zionists and their Western supporters. These awakened and devastated individuals were primarily the highly educated immigrants to North America, dating from the 1950s and thereafter. They were joined by some American-born Arab Americans who shared their agony of conscience. Among the immigrants was our highly valued colleague in the struggle for justice, Dr. Naseer Aruri. Our vehicle for action was the Association of Arab American University Graduates, which people know as AAUG, and it was formed after the war, after the '67 war, in November of 1967. The AAUG made us all aware of each other and provided a structure through which we could pursue the reversing of the injustices so deeply wounding our very souls. The AAUG members understood, and some witnessed, the hijacking and demographic transformation of Palestine. The Palestine catastrophe was emblazoned on our eyes and in our hearts. It flowed through our bloodstream, and it was waiting to be purged. No one embraced the burden of elevating the tortured body of Palestine and its people to public view more than Naseer Aruri.
The Palestinian people are the direct descendants of those who lived for 14 centuries in the land of Palestine, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. They have lived on that land as the majority, owning most of the land. They have been united in a common struggle against colonialism, against the British Mandate, and also against Zionist settlers during the interwar period. It is a cohesive community, it is a highly literate community, and it has remained cohesive despite the legal fragmentation and the physical fragmentation which fell on it in 1948. In 1948, this community has experienced what we call a Nakba, which means a catastrophe.
Here is the man I knew. He maintained a principled position on Palestine, no matter the ups and downs of official Palestinian policies and political pressures. His position was one state for Israelis and Palestinians with equal civil and human rights. He did not write public screeds or verbally whip his Arab and Arab American colleagues who embraced other options, but he never succumbed to their compromises. He learned from the South Africans that one does not willingly give up all of their rights to their land and their legacies. His criticism of such positions that were of a compromised nature was always nuanced, never publicly angry. However, his public criticism of the outrageous Oslo Accords and Palestinian leadership was of a different order than disagreeing with colleagues. These were signed accords, after all, designed to dissolve once and for all any hopes of Palestinian sovereignty and legal rights. His 1995 book, Obstruction of Peace, demonstrated authoritatively the intent of Oslo, which was to repackage and expedite the old goal of destruction of Palestinian national rights. His 2003 book, Dishonest Broker, updated the obstruction of peace. These two books, plus his 1983 edited book, Occupation, Israel over Palestine, among his many other publications, offer the most comprehensive understanding of the Palestinian tragedy in the context of American, Israeli, and Arab politics. While others occupied the limelight, Naseer kept writing and speaking. Often hidden in the shadows of others, his analysis had the highest public consumption rate. He spoke and wrote with great clarity based on meticulous research. He made the issues of Palestine, the Arab region, and the strategic machinations of the US and Israel accessible to thousands. He was a superb communicator and educator. As others came and went, hawking abysmal compromises constructed in conflict resolution seminars, Geneva hotels, and Oslo, Naseer never broke his stride on what he considered a just resolution for Palestinians and Israelis. After decades of Israeli occupation and the failure of so many false peace efforts, so many others across the world now echo Naseer's conclusion that resolution of the conflict is to be found in one state with equal citizenship rights for all.
Within a few years, Palestinians will constitute the absolute majority in all the territories today controlled by Israel. Already, the prospects of a workable and durable two-state solution are doubtful. Ultimately, it must be admitted that the core of this conflict, like in Northern Ireland, is about lack of equality and a gross imbalance of power and rights, and any solution, whether based on one state or two, cannot work unless it guarantees equality.
Now we take you to the University of Massachusetts in North Dartmouth, where a memorial event was held in tribute to Naseer Aruri. Naseer taught at the university for many, many years, and he was Chancellor Professor of Political Science there. He was held in great esteem by his students and the faculty and the administration. And the university was kind enough to host this event. We take you now to Maria Furman, a former student of Naseer's, who will host the event.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to UMass Dartmouth and to our memorial service today. It is very fitting to have this service here because Naseer spent so much of his life here, and he loved the university so very much. So it's very, very nice that our Chancellor was able to make all of this come true for the family. So it's very, very fitting that we're all here to honor him today. And thank you all for coming to help commemorate and celebrate the wonderful life of Naseer Aruri, our dear friend, colleague, father, husband, grandfather, professor at this university for over 30 years, a scholar activist, an author, and the many other roles that we know him by. We share sorrow and loss at his passing, but rejoice that we had our time together. My name is Maria Furman Duffy, and I am a Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the UMass system, and I would like to pass on our condolences to the family on behalf of the Board. We're glad to be able to honor him and share his memories with friends, colleagues, and family.
Each person listed in the program will speak briefly about Naseer. We have all been touched in various ways by his life, his energy, and his passions. They will share their experiences about how he touched them, as well as the love and laughter that made up the core of his life. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Davinda Grossman, the Chancellor of UMass Dartmouth, who will say a few words. She's been so very supportive in the planning of this service, as well as John Hoey, who has been terrific in making this happen. So I would like to thank her and her team very much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Trustee Furman. Good morning to all of you. I must add, Maria, that Naseer must have been very proud of you. Former student who graduated from UMass Dartmouth, rose to become the managing director at Standish, Air, and Wood in Boston, and is now the vice chair or the board of trustees of the entire University of Massachusetts system. That's the governing board for the entire system, including the 5 campuses. So thank you, Trustee Maria Furman. And I stand here as the Chancellor of UMass Dartmouth, representing many of the faculty, those who served when Professor Aruri was here, those who are faculty members at present. I have the Provost, Muhammad Karim, who's here, standing there. Provost Karim, you can sit. There's a vacant chair there. Our Senior Vice Chancellor, Jerry Kavanaugh. We have the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Jen Riley, here. And other members of my cabinet, would you please stand up so they know that you're in the house? Thank you. I would like to express condolences to the family of Professor Naseer Aruri. And although I have not had the pleasure of meeting all of you yet, I have met a few times with Joyce and Karen. And this morning, I met Faris and Jamal and Jay, and I met a number of Professor Aruri's grandchildren. There is such a feeling of warmth, and I could already tell just from walking into the room, there is a sense of family, a sense of community, many, many fond memories of Professor Aruri. The soul of any great university is the faculty, and we gather this morning to honor one of the greatest who ever served here at UMass Dartmouth, Chancellor Professor Naseer H. Aruri, an internationally renowned expert on the Middle East, an author or editor of 9 books, including one that was just published last year, titled A Bitter Legacy, the United States in the Middle East. Albert Einstein once said that peace cannot be kept by force, that it can only be achieved through understanding. It is an honor for me to stand here to celebrate the life of Chancellor Professor Aruri, who devoted 33 years of his life from 1965 to 1998 here at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth as a professor of political science, as a department chair, as a mentor to many students, as a colleague to many of you. He taught in these classrooms. He walked in these hallways. He explored and exchanged ideas with students and faculty members here. He attended events here. He held office hours here. He was part of the fabric and the texture of the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. And through his own way, he worked to achieve peace through understanding. I did not have the pleasure of knowing Professor Aruri, but over the past few months, I have been blessed to meet his wonderful, loving, and strong wife, Joyce. And I understand that when he passed away, it was 2 days short of your 54th wedding anniversary. And his loving daughter, Karen, who followed in her father's footsteps and also teaches here. She teaches French and Spanish. The stories that they have recounted about Naseer are stories of a man who loved teaching, who loved scholarship, who loved UMass Dartmouth, who loved his students, who loved his family, loved his wife dearly, loved his sons and his daughter, loved Faris and Jamal and Karen and Jay, and loved his 13 grandchildren, and loved the pursuit of peace and human dignity around the world. Now consider the reflection of retired Professor Mel Yokin, who's actually here in the crowd. He sent a note and described Professor Aruri. He said he will be remembered for his clear-minded intelligence, his consummate dignity, his indefatigable spirit, and his love of the French language. He was a brilliant man, held true and steadfast to his convictions and beliefs, yet very approachable at all levels to his colleagues and to his students. The qualities that made Naseer a great scholar, his lack of guile, his warmth and kindness, made him also a very good friend and colleague. We who were privileged to enjoy his friendship will miss him terribly. Thank you, Professor Yokin, for those recollections. If you could just raise your hand so they know you're here. He's back there. The turnout today is testament to the respect, the admiration, and love with which Professor Naseer Aruri is held, not only in the community on this campus, but in the community around the world. One need not agree with Naseer's viewpoints in order to respect and admire him. In fact, that is when you know, when you're faced with greatness and authenticity, when you can disagree and still admire. Admire the passion, the willingness to express sometimes a controversial or minority view, to admire the dedication to make an intellectual rather than an ideological argument. We certainly need a lot more of that ethos and in that spirit in our world today. This academic year is fast coming to a close. Commencement begins on May 15th. And it has been a celebration of the golden anniversary of the 1964 groundbreaking of the campus of the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. It was a year after the 1964 groundbreaking that a young man showed up on campus. He had earned his BA in history from the American International College and his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And that was Professor Naseer Aruri, who came to teach political science. That was a time when the mission of this campus was being challenged. There were those in Boston who believed that this campus should be limited to technical fields, but our students, our faculty, and the surrounding community would have none of that. They wanted and deserved more, and they wanted the campus to expand to liberal arts programs. And so they protested. They marched in a torch relay from Dartmouth to Boston to defend the idea that real higher education required more than an examination of the physical world, but an examination of ourselves and of our society. Thank goodness the protesters won, because otherwise Naseer Aruri would not have been able to set down roots here and become part of this community and earn a global reputation as an expert on the Middle East and have an impact on the lives of countless of students and faculty colleagues along the way. In a few weeks, we will send forth hundreds of newly minted Umass Dartmouth graduates. None of them in this class have the good fortune to be taught or mentored by Professor Aruri, as Trustee Maria Furman had been, but their education has undoubtedly been influenced by him, by his development of a world-class political science department, by his scholarship, and by his scholarly example that he has set for his colleagues and other students, not only in this class, but generations more of students to come. Sir Isaac Newton said, "If I had seen further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of giants." Naseer Aruri was one of our giants. Thank you.
Hanky in case I need it. So I'll leave it here for any future speakers. As the first speaker today, I would like to begin by telling you about the man I knew on a personal level, not about his work, his many career accomplishments, the books he wrote, the seminars he gave, the Palestinian cause that was always on his mind. No, not about that. Other people will cover that. But only about the things I will never forget that we shared as friends, the ordinary things of life that are so dear. It was my good fortune and privilege to meet the Aruri family back in the late 70s when I was a student, as I mentioned. He was my professor. He was so smart, so distinguished. His accent gave him an air of sophistication, and his classiness was hard to match. A bit intimidating for a girl like me, an immigrant from the Azores, struggling to find my place in a new land. Maybe that's why I liked him so much. We were both immigrants. He offered me his counsel, his time, and experience. Sometime after graduation, I met Joyce, the love of his life, and we developed a unique relationship that has evolved into my becoming a lifelong family friend. They became my advisors, my mentors, my cooking teachers, my travel companions, my friends, and so much more. But let me tell you a little about that. We all have many memories to share about Naseer, much like you, and I'd like to share some of these. I remember fondly that Naseer liked to cook, and also had quite a garden. That was the source of many vegetable dishes that he made. He was a man ahead of his time. I would call him an almost vegan. He loved his vegetables, and he grew them proudly, and there was always an abundance of produce in the house. I visited at least monthly, and he would whip up so many creative dishes that only he could season so well. Not forgetting to give Joyce credit, as she was a wonderful cook in her own right, and she did most of the cooking, actually. She did a lot of it. But when Naseer did it, it was unique. My favorite dish was his Umass soup, a peasant pea soup, and many of you might be familiar with this soup, that I watched him make often, and I would say, don't start cooking until I get there. I want to know how you do it. There was this thing about the seasoning that was his magic sauce, and it was very hard to figure out because every time he did it a little differently, but it all tasted so good, and he never measured. You know, it was a little of this and a little of that. So I would, then he would make great salads. We'd have hummus, tabbouleh, kibbeh, kanafi, hashwi, you name it, he made it, and I tried very hard to go home and replicate it. And I would follow them around with notepad in hand in the kitchen, taking notes and trying to get it all down so I could do this at home. Of course, it never came out quite right, unfortunately. I often said that I must have some Arabic blood, as I love all the food they made. And since the Moors occupied Portugal for over 700 years, no doubt that I do. Often, after our many dinners with us or other friends, the conversation turned to politics, places we wanted to go, and many other topics. We all loved to travel, and I was the one in the group who generally planned trips for us to take, having the pleasure to get Naseer and Joyce to try things that they would never do, wouldn't even dream of doing. I will never forget the times we went on ski trips for the weekend. You did not know Naseer skied? Did any of you know Naseer skied? Okay. Well, he did not, actually. Not actually. This is how they went. We would drive up with some other couples, load up the car with food. We'd rent a place in New Hampshire or Vermont, and he would spend the weekend cooking, making adas and other things, playing cards, lots of cards, laughing, and reading. Often never leaving the place for 3 days. So he'd come up, he'd stay the whole time. Others would ski, but Naseer and Joyce were in charge of food and fun. And we just loved those weekends. I was responsible for getting Joyce and Naseer to go camping for the first time. The year was 1977, and I remember it like yesterday. We took our little boat and went up to a campsite at Winnipesaukee Lake. Us, the 4 kids, the dog. Sounds like a happy picture. These guys remember. Except that it rained all weekend. Their tent leaked. Elvis died. I went into mourning. I cried. They tried to make me feel better. This was August 1977. They tried to make me feel better. I remember we played cards inside the wet tent. I think Ferris was holding the flashlight and we're trying to play poker, all crammed up into this little tent by flashlight. We cooked out of soup on the fire. Joyce couldn't sleep on the hard ground, and Naseer had to go to the chiropractor when he got home. But we all said it was the best time and we would do it again, except Joyce said she'd have to stay at the motel, so we didn't actually do it again. I also influenced them into taking sailing lessons on Boston Harbor. And it turned out to, unfortunately, be a very windy week. And they had an Israeli instructor who was fabulous, but they spent a lot of time talking about you-know-what. So I don't know if they learned any sailing that week. Naseer got into boating, and as you all know, he loved to fish and go out on his boat. I had a small motorboat at the time that he bought from me, and then, after that, his boats kept getting bigger and bigger, because the kids also got bigger and bigger. We went on a trip one year to Martha's Vineyard, one 4th of July, on that small boat, and the engine died. I still recollect Karen and I waving white towels, and we sent out flares, but of course on the 4th of July, a flare means nothing. And the white towels weren't big enough, but we were trying to get somebody's attention. But we did get rescued, and after that he got a better boat. We traveled to Italy and around Tuscany and saw the Palio and Siena. And we spent a lot of time in Florida together, again cooking and playing cards and laughing and traveling, and we had places near each other. Our last trip was about 5 years ago when I had the pleasure of going to the Azores with them, a place we talked about for 40 years, so it was very gratifying that he finally got to see it. We had many special times that I will always remember. Our lives were intertwined for 40 years. I was so blessed to have his friendship and share good times as a family. His impact on my life is hard to describe. He is irreplaceable. A kind and generous man of integrity, courage, love of others, and love of service. His values, his intellect, his passion for justice, all without peer. He was above all a family man. He raised 4 outstanding children, 13 lucky grandchildren, and Joyce, his constant companion and his best caretaker in good times and bad, is a woman of courage and strength, my role model as well. I can't imagine my life without these 2 key people in it. There's an empty spot in my heart today, and there will be no new memories to make. Our time together was short. We will miss you, Naseer, but know that you are loved. I would like to have Jamel come up. I'll leave the hang.
I actually remember that camping trip. Is it on? I remember that camping trip really well, and I think we were probably 10 or 11 years old at the time, and it was kind of strange to us that you actually could convince my mother to go camping, because it's really not her thing. And we're in the tent, me and my brothers and sisters, and the rain's coming down, and my mother seems really, really aggravated, and Maria is bawling, and I assume that you were upset because you had coerced my mother into going camping, and it was a disaster. So I said to my mother, I said, "Why is Maria crying?" And she says, "I don't know, Elvis died." Yeah, the king wasn't really a big deal in our house growing up. Whole thing got lost on us, but at any rate, thanks Maria, thanks Dr. Grossman, thanks all the wonderful staff that is here and did so much work to really make this such a memorable day. It's nice to be here. It's comforting to be here because everything that was important to my father, our father, is actually in this room. Joyce, our treasured mother, his companion for over half a century, his children and their spouses, 13 grandchildren, in case you're wondering what order they're in. Jay has provided buttons for him, which is really nice, and will give you the order along with the picture of Cito. And he has nieces and nephews here, Reem and Hassan, in-laws, friends, students, colleagues, and we're in the physical structure of the university that he taught at for 33 years and loved very much. At the life's journey for my father was anything but predictable. He had grown up in Jerusalem, Palestine. He had graduated from high school. He was doing some teaching there, and he wasn't really sure what his next step was going to be. But it was decided that he would go to the United States to pursue an education. And his father, at the time, he was, this point, my father was 20 years old, and his father gave him a plane ticket, one semester's tuition and money, and 2 pieces of advice. And those were study something practical and stay away from women. And I can say he succeeded on neither front. The plan was to attend AIC, American International College in Springfield, where his older brother Saeed, the father of my cousin Hassan and my cousin Rima, had already been an undergraduate there. And he knew little about America and even really less about the college that he was going to be attending. My uncle Saeed had picked up my father at Logan Airport. It was a rainy day in December 1954, and he drove him to his first home in America. And it had the seemingly benign address of 50 Western Avenue in Springfield, which also happened to be the Zeta Chi fraternity house. For people who know my father, that's not exactly the best fit for the young, idealistic, studious Naseer. Like many immigrants, he really struggled, especially in his early life, with the concept of identity. As a young boy in Palestine, his family had residences both in Jerusalem and the village that his family would spend summers in Braham, which is not too far away. And there were terms that were used in Palestine, Arabic terms throughout the Arab world for city kids versus village kids, and they were important at that time in terms of understanding distinctions. And when he was in Jerusalem, the city kids would call him a falah, which was kind of the boy from the village or the country. And when he would go back to the village after the school year was done in Braham, they would call him Medini, which is the city kid. And both groups of kids would say either Medini or Falah pejoratively. In other words, you're not one of us. So he was caught between this, this city distinction versus village distinction. And then he ends up at Zeta Chi fraternity house, where I'm guessing the Falah-Medini dichotomy of 20th century Palestine wasn't exactly a hot topic. And then he was referred to simply as Saeed's brother. He had a difficult time at AIC. He really did. Despite its name, it had very few international students. It didn't have a single political science course, which is what he wanted to study. He spent most of his time studying, and he was working second shift at a local textile factory in order to pay for his tuition and his living expenses. And it really wasn't until he met and later fell in love with a young woman of Lebanese ancestry named Joyce Thomas that things began to change for the better for my dad. And although he was a Muslim from Palestine and she a Maronite Catholic from Springfield, the love that they had for each other transcended religious affiliations. And while at this time that type of union was not popular, my parents really were never into what was popular. They were into what was right. And their decision to fall in love, marry, and start a family could not have been more right. The young couple soon forged a joint identity, an inseparable bond based upon shared values, mutual respect, and an uncanny admiration for the other. Following their marriage, my father had no job, little money, and he knew that he would need to get a PhD in order to secure employment. The young couple drove from Springfield down to Baton Rouge in an old, beat-up car to LSU, And then they went on to Texas Tech with their firstborn in tow, Faris, in the back seat. And my father pursued graduate courses at Texas Tech. Living in the Deep South in the mid-1960s, their views on equality were unpopular, their bank account near empty, and their future very much up in the air. It wasn't until a full grant for PhD program opened up at Umass Amherst, and later a full-time faculty position had opened up at this university, that they were able to find a bit of stability. My father would eventually emerge as a specialist in the Middle East in general, and Palestine in particular, and he began to write and speak widely in this area. And although there were many obstacles facing the Palestinian people, there was always a pervasive theme that he would refer to in his speaking engagements and in his writing. And that's what he called transforming constraints into opportunities. It also just so happened to be a microcosm of his early life in America. Although my father was both a scholar and an activist, activism always took precedent. He spent the majority of his life working and fighting so that the Palestinian people could attain a normal existence. And in a field where there have been countless sellouts, inflated egos, and opportunities for personal gain, my father always remained focused on advancing the cause of his people. Not only his people, but all dispossessed peoples around the world. He was as principled as they come, never dogmatic, and not a speechmaker. His approach was always rational and grounded, never engaging in rhetoric or bravado. He never allowed a feeling of self-importance to get in the way of working with others to advance the cause. And whether that meant collaborating with renowned intellectuals or mentoring a young student who had expressed an interest in Palestine, my father's commitment remained the same. He wasn't without his shortcomings, however. His strong work ethic also resulted in a failure to sometimes appreciate his limitations. As children, my brother and Jay, growing up, had to endure multiple odd-looking haircuts due to my father's conviction that he was as capable a barber as he was a professor. Even our large poodle Frankie was not exempt from my father's fascination with his clippers. I recall spending a hot summer afternoon where my father pulled out his clippers. We had just adopted Frankie a couple of days ago. He didn't know us very well, and my father thought it would be a good idea to give Frankie a haircut. Jay and I were glad we went first. And I remember being with my siblings and my mother, and we were trying to hold this dog steady, and there was a tug-of-war going on, and my father's out there with his clippers, and he's clipping this very large poodle and the large, curly, thick black hair. It seemed like it went on for hours, and after the last curl had been trimmed, my father was marveling at the fruits of his labor, and Frankie proceeded to run up the street as fast as any dog could run. We never saw Frankie again. And that's a true story. Growing up in our house, the traditional sexist roles of the time that were assigned to husband and wife were actually reversed in our house. People probably know, some of you might not, but most people do, that my father couldn't distinguish a touchdown from a home run, let alone understand the complexities of American sports. So it was my mother who would take us to all of our football, basketball, and baseball games, and my father remained home cooking dinner. Once in a while, my father would appear at one of our sporting events, not really understanding what was going on, and depending on what the Reagan White House did or said that day, it was 50-50 whether he would rise for the national anthem. Like many of his fellow patriots, my father was never really completely at ease in America or in the Arab world, and this would often lead to, let's just say, some inconsistencies on occasion. He would often reminisce about the wonderful simplicity of life in the Arab world that included large gatherings of family and friends in modest homes, until one of those gatherings actually took place. Then he would horrifically recount the chain-smoking guests arriving hours late, kids running wild with no parental supervision, and all the excess food that was central to the culture he had just earlier embraced. As my brothers and sisters are well aware, my father's lectures in the house were no less comprehensive than those in the classroom. We know never to say that we were starving, because there were children that actually were, and not to complain about what we didn't have, because most of the world had far less. And while as a kid the lectures would seem old and tiresome, today we're all grateful that our parents stressed idealism over assimilation, compassion over self-interest, and resistance over silence. And Dad, those values that you and Mom instilled in us didn't fall on deaf ears. When your illness progressed and life had become so difficult for you, your family never stopped trying to make all those difficult days a bit more bearable. Karen, your daughter, who took her first steps the day that you got your PhD, she held you up, she held Ma up. Her courage and strength helped us all up. She'd fight back the tears while cooking your favorite Arabic meals to bring to you. Her sorrow would turn to joy, as did yours, when your face would light up as she entered your room. She made sure your sisters were okay after caring for you, because she promised you that she would. Faris, visiting you virtually every day after long hours at work, completely exhausted and continually astonishing your nurses and physical therapists as we'd get you out of bed and walk you through the halls of the rehab facility, both of you proud of each and every step you took. At every juncture, he made sure the care you were getting was the best care possible, and no one was as invested in the hope that you would overcome your illness as him. Jay, giving Ma some much-needed rest by sleeping with you in the hospital after your stroke, driving his family up and back from Cincinnati to be with you every chance he had. Despite his towering physical presence that he got from you, he is the most sensitive of all your children. And it hurt him so much to see you unhappy. While dealing with the commitments of a job and family, he worked endless hours behind the computer and on the telephone to make today a memorable one. Ma, she loved you more than any wife could love a husband. You hated when she left the room, whether you were young and vibrant or old and frail. Your lifelong companion, your confidant, your anchor. The woman who pushed you toward all of your life's achievements. You looked up to her more than any dignitary, intellectual giant, or world leader you ever crossed paths with. As you got weaker, she was constantly by your side, telling you not to worry, everything was going to be okay, while masking the heartache of knowing that it wasn't. And while you never lived to see justice for Palestine and a dignified life for your people, surely the constraints they continue to face will one day be transformed into opportunities. And while this day will have come without you bearing witness, it will mark the harvest of the seedlings that you and countless others planted during the best days of your life. Parkinson's disease may have taken your life, but there is no force in this world strong enough that can erase all the good you left behind. We love you. We admire you. We miss you so very much. Your physical presence is no longer here, but everything you've helped create, you've championed, and worked tirelessly throughout your life remains. Thank you.
You are watching the memorial events held at Umass Dartmouth in tribute to Naseer Aruri. In addition, we also would like to bring you commentary of some of his friends that were not on the formal speaking program, but were able to provide their own observations.
Naseer for us was always the quintessential gentleman. Naseer never spoke ill about anyone. In all my years of interacting with him, I have never ever heard him speak badly about anyone, any of his colleagues, any one of our colleagues that we work with, even though we would disagree with them vehemently sometimes. Naseer never ever spoke ill of them. So he was always the gentleman par excellence. And he always kept bridges and lines of communication open with everybody. And so everybody respected him because he was a man of integrity. He was a man who held fast to his principles, and he never ever deviated from these principles. And time has proven that those principles and values that he held that dominated his life, personal life, and also dominated his scholarly contributions as a Palestinian scholar, whose contribution is extremely important. The time has come to show that contribution, shaped by the man that he was and the origins that he came from, the time has now proven that this was probably the correct path for us to take.
Well,
and that is, you know, his work focused on several things. One, for example, he disabused us or anyone who might have had an illusion that the United States would be an honest broker in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His work was probably the most significant contribution to disabuse people of that notion that the U.S. could be an honest broker. The U.S. is a party to the conflict on the side of Israel and has never been an honest broker at all. That's, for example, one major contribution. And I think the second contribution, important contribution in my opinion, and strategic, is the commitment to not to a two-state solution, which was a foolish notion. We all knew that to be a foolish notion, but a commitment to a democratic state where Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, everybody would have political equality and equal rights. A state for all of its citizens, with the right of the refugees to return to their homes. That commitment, I think, which came from the kind of analysis he made as a progressive Arab nationalist, and as someone who fundamentally believed that what was happening in Palestine was a historic colonial settler process whose ultimate purpose was to eradicate the memory of the native population and to eliminate the native population and to ethnically cleanse them completely. So this was his analysis, and I think he has proven to be absolutely correct. So the time now has come for people to appreciate the full value of his contribution as a Palestinian scholar and as a committed nationalist who fought for many, many years, I think, for human rights, both at the Palestinian level and at the Arab level.
One of the invited speakers was Dr. Sarah Roy. She was not able to be there at that time And so we are able now to connect with Dr. Aruri by Skype so that she may present her memorial talk about Dr. Aruri. Dr. Sarah Aruri is a senior research scholar, an associate of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Sarah Aruri.
Thank you. When I was pursuing my doctoral studies in international development, I knew that I wanted to do research in the Middle East, particularly around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I was unable to find a research topic that excited me, combining my disciplinary interest in development with my regional interest in the Middle East. So I turned my attention to Africa and fell in love with Tanzania. After much thought and planning, I set my research sights on the Maasai people. 1 year later, however, I found myself in a totally different place, interviewing people in the refugee camps of the Gaza Strip and in factories and labor organizations inside the West Bank. I was immersed in a reality that staggered me, helped by people I barely knew, whose assistance would have been inconceivable to me just a short time before. It was the mid-1980s, and at the time, I did not fully appreciate that I was entering a field of study and academic research that was politically volatile and extremely contentious, for which there was little support and even less understanding, inside the academy and beyond. As a Jew and child of Holocaust survivors, my work was beyond comprehension to many, if not most people in my own community, including certain members of my extended family, a betrayal for which some have never forgiven me. When I think back over those 30 years, there were, of course, many difficulties and painful times. But more importantly, there were profound rewards and experiences that have been among the most meaningful of my life. Among those rewards are the truly remarkable human beings I came to know along the way. One cannot continue along such an arduous, albeit necessary path alone. It is simply not possible. Naseer was preeminent among those extraordinary individuals I encountered. I read his work years before I knew him, and his work showed me, as a young and inexperienced graduate student, that it is possible to challenge dominant ways of thinking and framing, that it is possible to shift, if not transform, intellectual boundaries and exercise much-needed criticism in a society actively positioned against such criticism. Naseer showed me that it is possible and crucial to make one's work public and accessible, and by doing so, resist the displacement of people's lived realities into simplistically reduced constructs. He taught me that it is essential not only to see things as they are, but how they came to be, and to show that they are not inevitable but conditional, the product of human choices that can, and Naseer believed, will be changed. He embodied the role of the public intellectual and teacher in its truest sense, refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice, confronting extant orthodoxies rather than accepting them, and expanding the boundaries of legitimate debate. Naseer was among those few courageous scholars who, at an unwelcoming and indeed hostile time, painstakingly and with great determination, carved out the intellectual and political space that I, among myriad others, have entered and hopefully widened, legitimizing a discourse that the majority had long shunned and dismissed. Naseer was an individual and a scholar of immense integrity and dignity, always consistent in who he was and what he believed, and open to new ways of thinking and understanding. I cannot remember a time when I saw him get angry. He treated others with respect and consideration, including those with whom he disagreed. It was my great honor and privilege to have known and learned from him. I would not be who I am without his humane and luminous example. Thank you.
Well, I met him when I first came into Association of Arab American University Graduates, and I was of the generation of the graduate students when some of the better established professors were trying to create this new organization. And this, of course, was Naseer and Edward Said and Ibrahim Abdul and Michael Silliman and yourself. And Elaine, you were really one of the big pathfinders for us.
Thank you.
And what was remarkable about this organization, and I think that really places Naseer in context, is that it was a real serious attempt to give the young scholars of Arab American background a voice in the United States. That is, I think until that time, many of you ahead of us were very successful in your academic careers, but we didn't have a collective voice. We didn't have a collective identity. And I think learning from the immigrant experience in the United States, perhaps the best collective identity was going to be something around the Palestine issue. I think that's the one unifying theme that we all discovered, and that you really ahead of us framed it for us. So I see Naseer, and I remember seeing him as one of the original framers of this idea, that for us to have a voice in the United States as the intellectual elite, we needed really to understand how to wrap ourselves around the Palestine issue. You know, this was not that novel in those days, but today, of course, it's quite a novel idea, because today we are seeing competition from other favorite themes in the Arab world. But in those days, we took this on very quickly, I think all of us. And so we started this journal, the Arab Studies Quarterly, or you guys started it, which again was open to everybody, to all kinds of voices, but particularly to young, unempowered Arab American intellectuals. And that was of great value for me in my career and in my academic life. And, you know, Naseer was really the pace setter. Naseer is very unusual, I think much more so than Edward and then Ibrahim Abdul-Lubud, in that his career was always at the Palestine issue, and that's what he was focused on. And he always placed it in the context of Arab unity. I mean, he knew exactly ideologically where he was. You could see that from his writings, from his papers, from the lectures that he delivered in the annual conventions. It was not only Palestine as a Palestinian issue. It was Palestine in the context of the wider Arab theme. And that's really his contribution. And he continued to do this, you know, especially with Samih Farsoon and with you and with many other people. Particularly, I think I was very impressed by the book Palestine and the Palestinians, because it was something that provided sociological insights into what Palestine was, and primarily to demonstrate that Palestinian society was evolving at the time of the Zionist invasion of Palestine, and that it was really moving. It wasn't really as static as Zionist writers tell us. And so this was something very tricky to write about and to provide. But they did it. He and Samih did it very well. So I learned a lot from that. I learned not to accept the usual canon, but to really go beyond that, because I knew, of course, from my family life, indeed as Naseer knew from his own family life, that we Palestinians were moving. We were really advancing. We were not as backward as the world would like us to appear. Certainly in the Zionist rhetoric, we were supposedly people who didn't have an identity, didn't have a political identity, were basically rural elements. We were not rural elements. We were really commercial elements, upper class elements. This was a society that was evolving. It was being differentiated into different classes. And I found this a fascinating theme. And then, of course, later on, Naseer really branched into human rights and how we can really fit the Palestine issue in the context of international human rights struggle. And again, this was a new venue for us. This was really new. In other words, we needed to link up with a new awareness in the world community about international human rights. We need to tell everybody that Palestinian human rights have been abused for a long period of time. And Naseer did this by sponsoring conferences, by himself becoming a member of Amnesty International Board, Human Rights Watch. In other words, he was, to me, the ideal scholar activist. He was really the scholar engagé. That's, to us in AAUG, in Association of Arab American University Graduates, was the ideal. None of us were going to be an ivory tower academic, not after the model of people like Naseer. We were going to be all very good scholars if we can, but also activists if we can, because we needed a political will to place our issue on the international agenda. And we, the intellectuals, more than the PLO, more than the people in the field, we have to place our issue in the context of international studies. We have to do it ourselves. And so the work was really hard. It wasn't really that easy. In other words, we really have to fight a lot of different presentations from different groups of people. And then the last thing I want to say, and I think Elaine, you agree with me about this, Naseer was an outstandingly humble human being. He was unbelievably humble. I mean, I always enjoyed talking to him. I always loved reading him. He never put on himself any airs. He never placed himself above the younger scholars. He was there to guide everybody. You could always approach him. And he mentored a lot of people. He certainly mentored a number of younger scholars. We don't have time to name them. This is unique, I think, in the experience of the Arab American academic community. That is, most of the established scholars get involved in their own careers. No, not Naseer. You know, Naseer had left a lot of people behind him who will really miss him, will miss his guidance, because he was a mentor, and that is a rare, rare quality.
We close our program for today. Next week we will conclude the program of the memorial events in honor of Naseer Aruri.
Commitment, dedication, and attachment to his Palestinian Arab identity.
He conveyed an authentic, innate sense of gender equality.
Elevated the plight of the Palestinians to a level on the world platform.
The ACLU greatly valued Naseer's commitment to civil liberties and civil rights.
Naseer was very good as a department chairperson.
One simple purpose is what Naseer was all about, and that was raising consciousness about Palestinian trauma.
He criticized the Palestinian leadership for its unpreparedness, lack of any concrete strategy.
Naseer and I shared exactly 54 years of marriage. Naseer was very efficient. I kissed him goodbye on February 12th, 2015, the 54th anniversary of our wedding.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.